She followed the prints the way a person follows a path they know they shouldn't follow, the way you read one more page of something upsetting because stopping feels worse than continuing. At the far right section, by the drain pipe, the prints waited. She put her hands in them. The fit was perfect. The fit was worse than perfect. The fit was intimate in a way she found obscene. This railing had been practicing her grip, had been learning the specific pressure of her specific anxiety, and now it offered her that learning back like a service, like a comfort, and the comfort was the horror. The shape in the reflection was there immediately, beside her reflection in the wet metal. Curtain thin, half a second behind, more committed to her posture than she was. Petra had lived in the Vanthorpe for 3 years, and she'd heard the building talk the way buildings in old neighbourhoods talk, in fragments and rumours, one neighbour to another over the mailboxes, but she'd never been someone who paid attention to that kind of talk. She was a practical person. She was an accountant. She understood numbers and she understood time, and she did not understand buildings that developed memory or presences that fed on postponement, and she was not interested in developing that understanding. She was interested in getting back inside and finishing the wine and going to sleep and calling her sister on Wednesday. Wednesday was realistic. Wednesday gave her time to think about what to say. Wednesday. The second handprint appeared to her right, then the third, a foot further. The path was moving the other direction this time, not toward the drain pipe but back toward the door, as though the railing was laying out the route home, as though even the escape route was being practiced before she could take it, as though Balconshade was trying on her intention to leave so that when she finally moved in that direction, it would have already been there first. Petra Voss did not release the railing. She said it out loud. "I'll call her tomorrow." And she said it quietly, almost under her breath, the way you say something you know is wrong but are too tired to fight against. And the rail felt different immediately, felt different in her palms, felt like something had recognised the phrase, had been waiting for exactly that configuration of syllables, "Tomorrow, I'll do it tomorrow," and had received it the way a machine receives input. The second shape sharpened, not immediately, not all at once, but over the next 3 minutes as Petra stood at the railing not going inside. The curtain shape beside her reflection in the wet metal got clearer, got more defined, got more specific, began to have the particular quality of presence that meant it knew the weight of her forearms and the angle of her head when she was thinking about something she'd promised herself she'd do and hadn't done. It had her number. It had had her number for a while, maybe since the first night she'd stood out here with the not calling her sister thought, maybe longer, maybe from the first night she'd stood at this rail with any unfinished business in her chest. She went inside eventually, but the going inside felt different, felt guided, felt like a movement she'd made before she decided to make it, felt like falling off a curb. Not chosen, not exactly, just happened. She poured the rest of the wine down the drain and stood at the kitchen sink gripping the edge and looked at the dark window and her reflection in it, and thought that her reflection looked like it was waiting for her to do something, and she couldn't figure out what. On Wednesday she did not call her sister. She went out to the balcony instead. The building had 7 floors and 42 apartments, and of the 42, perhaps 14 had tenants in the habit of using their balconies at night. Not all of them with the weight of something unsaid. Some just went out for cigarettes or to look at the moon, on clear nights or to let their cats sniff the outdoor air. But the ones who went out with the postponed business, with the undelivered sentences, those the railing knew, those it learned. In 2B, there was a man named Gerald who had not spoken to his adult son in 3 years following an argument about money and politics that had metastasized into a referendum on the whole relationship, and Gerald went out to the balcony at 11 p.m. most nights, and stood at the second floor rail and thought about calling and didn't, thought about a letter and didn't write it, thought about driving to his son's house in Ridgewood and showing up unannounced, and didn't do that either. He had been doing this long enough that the railing in front of his usual spot had a particular sheen to it, a warmth in the metal that shouldn't have been there given the temperature, as though the iron had been absorbing the heat of his hands for years and now held it permanently. In 6A there was a woman named Simone who was 67 and who had a medical diagnosis she hadn't told her 2 daughters about, a diagnosis that was not fatal but was serious and required treatment and life adjustment, and which would worry them tremendously, and she was not going to tell them until after the holidays, except she'd been saying that since June and it was now October, and there had been 2 sets of holidays since June without telling them, and she stood at her 6th floor balcony in the rain because the rain felt like privacy and the railing felt like something to hold on to. In 5C there was a young woman named Danny who was 24 and who had a performance review coming up at work and who knew she was underperforming and knew exactly why. She'd been spending 3 hours a day at her desk in what her therapist called dissociation and what her managers were beginning to call something else. And she kept meaning to address it, kept meaning to send an email to her manager preemptively to take control of the narrative, to at least be the one who named the problem before someone else named it for her. But instead she went out to the balcony and stood at the rail and thought about the email and drafted sentences in her head and found each one insufficient and went back inside without sending anything and came back out the next night for the same exercise. The Van Thorpe apartment complex had been accumulating postponement for 31 years. Since the building opened, since the first tenants moved in with their ordinary human failures to act on necessary things, the balcony railings had been recording. Not with malice. That was the wrong frame for it. The wrong register. Malice implies desire, and Balconshade did not desire in the way living things desire. It just received. It was a receiver. It received the handprints and the weight and the angle of the lean and the particular quality of human stillness that accompanies the thought, I'll say it tomorrow, and it kept those things with a faithfulness that had nothing to do with love or cruelty and everything to do with the simple fact that metal, treated long enough to the same pressures, simply learns their shape. 31 years, 7 floors, 14 balconies in regular use. By October of this particular year, the learning had accumulated past some threshold. The way a river accumulates silt until it changes course. The way a joint wears until it gives. The learning had become something denser than memory and was beginning gradually to become something like will. The night it went wrong began in 3D. The tenant's name was Anthony Weir, and he was a high school biology teacher, and he had been on the balcony for 2 hours and 18 minutes, which was the longest anyone in the building's history had stood at a railing on a single night. He'd broken the old record held by Gerald in 2B, who'd once stood out there for 2 hours and 4 minutes on the anniversary of the argument with his son, and who had come. Inside afterwards so cold that he'd run a hot bath and sat in it for an hour before his hands stopped shaking. Anthony Weir was out there because of a student. His name was Corey. 17 years old, junior year, 3rd period AP Bio. 3 weeks ago, Corey had come to Anthony after class to ask about the extra credit assignment. And Anthony, half reading the paper the student had handed him, and half thinking about something else entirely, had made a comment about the student's work that had been dismissive and sharp in a way Anthony had not intended. A casual cruelty, the kind that happens when a good person is running on empty, and their attention lapses, and they say the thing they're thinking without the usual filters. He'd seen the student's face change. He'd known immediately that he'd been unkind and had felt the particular sick jolt of having been unkind to someone who hadn't deserved it. He'd opened his mouth to walk it back, and then the next student had come in with a question, and the moment had closed and Anthony had spent 3 weeks thinking about apologising and finding reasons not to. What if Corey didn't remember? What if bringing it up made it worse? What if an apology from a teacher to a student was somehow inappropriate or strange or created a new awkwardness in place of the old one? What if? What if? What if? The mind's tremendous talent for generating reasons to delay, all of them with a grain of logic, none of them the actual reason, which was simply that saying I was unkind to you and I'm sorry, required a quality of exposure that Anthony's particular emotional architecture had never found easy. So he stood at the railing in the rain for 2 hours and 18 minutes rehearsing the version of the apology that would land right, that would close cleanly, that would achieve the goal without the exposure. He was looking for the perfect sentence. The problem was there was no perfect sentence. There was only the approximately honest sentence, delivered with approximately correct timing, and that sentence was available to him right now, tomorrow morning, when he saw Corey in 3rd period. It was available, and he would not use it because he was looking for the version that didn't require him to feel anything while he said it. The handprints had been appearing for over an hour. He'd noticed them around the 40-minute mark and had done what a biology teacher does. He'd examined them methodically, formed a hypothesis, tested the hypothesis, and when the test failed, because the prints did not respond to his presence the way precipitation and surface tension should respond, because the prints were his exactly, because the prints were appearing ahead of him as though the railing was working from a script, he set aside the hypothesis and moved to observation without conclusion, which is what you do in a lab when the data doesn't fit the model. He watched the prints appear. He watched the curtain shape in the reflection. He watched the path they were laying out for him, toward the left corner of his third-floor balcony. He followed the path. He put his hands in the waiting prints at the corner and felt the fit and stood there with the fit for approximately 90 seconds. And in those 90 seconds, something happened that hadn't happened on any previous balcony, on any previous night. The thing in the reflection turned its face. Not a face. It didn't have a face exactly. But the place where a face would be, the upper portion of the curtain shape, oriented toward him rather than toward the courtyard. It was no longer watching the same view he was watching. It was watching him. It had stopped mimicking his outward posture and was doing something else, something without a name in the available vocabulary, something that felt like being studied by your own shadow. Anthony's hands, which had been gripping the railing hard, began to cramp. He told himself to let go, and his hands did not let go. This was new. This was different from the ordinary failure to act that had kept him on the balcony for 2 hours. This was the hands not responding to instruction, the gap between intent and movement taking on a physical quality, the body malfunctioning at the point of interface with the railing. He watched his own knuckles. He watched them whiten further. He focused on the right hand and issued the instruction. Release. Open the fingers. Lift the palm. The right hand tightened. Not dramatically. Not with violence. It just tightened. Took a better grip, if anything. The fingers adjusting for purchase on the slick metal. The thumb hooking under the top bar of the railing, as though the hand was taking instructions from somewhere other than Anthony's conscious mind. As though someone else had been given the remote. He heard the sound then. The sound he'd been half hearing for 40 minutes and filing under ambient building noise. The sound of metal under sustained pressure, not the sharp protest of structural stress, but the dull, continuous groan of something that's been pushed past tolerance for a long time and has decided to settle into the new shape. The railing wasn't bending, it wasn't buckling. The sound wasn't structural failure. It was something settling in, getting comfortable, the way an old house settles in winter when the temperature drops and the wood contracts and finds its new configuration. Anthony's left hand joined the right in tightening. The curtain shape in the reflection came closer, not forward in space, but forward in definition, as though it was focusing, sharpening from a blur into a specificity. Anthony could see now that it had the exact width of his shoulders, the exact length of his arms, the exact slight hunch of someone who has been standing in the same position for too long and whose back is beginning to ache and who has not adjusted because they're too focused on the rehearsal to notice the body's complaints. The shape was a perfect topography of him. A map. Not his appearance, but his posture. The specific shape of someone who refuses to go inside and refuses to act and refuses to choose, who just stands here being almost ready forever. He said, "Corey, I owe you an apology." To the rain, to the empty courtyard, out loud. "Not I'll apologise tomorrow." He caught that version before it arrived and bit it back, and gave the other version instead. For a moment, a fraction, the print stopped appearing. The curtain shape wobbled. Then Anthony made the mistake of adding, "I'll find the right moment tomorrow in class," and there it was, tomorrow. The word landed in the rain-soaked air and the railing received it, and the curtain shape sharpened back to its maximum definition, and Anthony's hands were no longer his hands, not in any meaningful sense, not in the sense of responding to him. They were hands on a railing doing what hands on that railing had been trained to do, which was grip, which was hold, which was stay. Anthony Weir began to scream, which was remarkable because he was a calm person who did not scream as a rule, and he screamed because he was standing 8 feet above a third-floor balcony. No, wait, that wasn't right. The distance was wrong. He stopped. He looked down. He was on the outside of the railing. Not the inside, the outside. Somehow during the 90 seconds of tightening and the curtain shape watching him, and the prints multiplying, he had gone from standing on the balcony with his hands on the railing to standing on the outer edge of the railing with his hands behind him gripping the bars, his back to the courtyard, the whole third floor drop behind his heels. He had no memory of climbing over. He had no memory of mounting the rail, but his feet were on the exterior ledge and his heels were over nothing, and between him and the wet pavement of the courtyard there was 3 stories of rain and the 8-story residents who pressed their faces to their dark windows. At the sudden sound of screaming said later that they'd seen him out there on the outside of the railing, but that they couldn't understand how he'd gotten there because none of them had seen him move. Anthony's hands were the only things that had firm purchase. Hands on the bars, back to the void. The curtain shape in the reflection on the outer surface of the rail was directly in front of him now, arranged in the same positions, mirrored, hands on the same bars, same grip. The delay was gone. There was no half-second lag. They moved together perfectly. He thought, if I release the railing, I will fall. He thought, if I don't release the railing, I don't know what happens. He thought, I should have said it Tuesday. I should have found Corey on Tuesday. He placed both hands on his own chest, not in the composed, breathtaking way that Marcus had done upstairs, in a desperate lunge, wrenching his hands off the bars and slapping them flat to his sternum and immediately grabbing the bars, again because he needed to, because he was 3 floors up on the outside of a railing in the rain, and one hand on his chest was a luxury he couldn't hold for more than half a second. But half a second was enough. He'd had them there. He'd felt his own heartbeat, racing, tactile, undeniable proof of the living specific thing that was him, and not the practicing shape. And in that half second a sentence arrived that was not a performance, and not a rehearsal. I was unkind to a 17-year-old kid, and I'm ashamed, and I'm going to tell him that in the morning. He said it out loud, to the rain, 8 floors above the courtyard that was not 8 floors. He was 3 floors he needed to stop confusing himself. 3 floors, 15 feet, survivable if it came to it, but it was not going to come to it. He was going to... The prints ahead of him faded. The wet sheen of the outer railing smoothed. The shape in the reflection came apart into ordinary refraction, ordinary distortion, the way all reflections are distorted in water at night, containing nothing but light. Anthony climbed back over the railing. He did it slowly and badly because his knees had gone soft and his hands were shaking, and the metal was slick and he nearly went over the wrong way twice, but he made it, and he stood on the balcony interior and sat down hard on the wet painted concrete because standing wasn't available to him, and he sat there in the rain for another 10 minutes just breathing. He went inside. He composed an email to Corey on his phone before he went to sleep, not the perfectly worded version, the approximately honest version. He sent it at 3:14 a.m. and lay awake for another hour waiting for a reply that didn't come until 7:30 the next morning, which said, "Thanks for saying that, Mr. W. Genuinely means a lot. See you in class." Anthony Weir slept better than he had in 3 weeks. Gerald in 2B did not have Anthony Weir's ending. Gerald had been cultivating his postponement for 31 months, not 3 weeks. Long enough that the railing at his usual spot on the second-floor balcony had stopped requiring his presence to generate the prints. The prints were there when he arrived. They were already formed, already fresh, already shaped like his hands, already waiting for him when he stepped out in his bathrobe at 11 p.m. the way he did every night. He put his hands in them as naturally as putting on gloves. The fit had always been perfect. He'd never thought too hard about why. He and Robert, his son, had fought about the election and the money and the nature of respect and the history of being raised a certain way and what was owed and what wasn't, and both of them had said true things in cruel ways and cruel things in true ways, and the conversation had ended with a door that remained technically open, but which neither of them had walked back through in 31 months. Gerald's wife, Catherine, had died 8 months into the silence, and Gerald had called Robert to tell him, and they'd had 3 careful, minimal exchanges around the funeral arrangements, and then the door had closed again. Robert had not come to the funeral, which Gerald found unforgivable, and Robert had not come because Gerald had said, in one of the 3 careful exchanges, something that was technically factually accurate, and was also one of the cruelest things one person can say to another about a shared grief. Robert had hung up. Gerald had stood in his kitchen holding the dead phone and known immediately that he'd done something that would cost him the rest of whatever relationship remained, and had been standing at the railing ever since, working on the sentence that would take it back. You could not take it back. That was the thing Gerald could not make himself accept. You could acknowledge it. You could own it. You could say, I said that, and I was wrong, and I was in pain, and I took my pain out on you in the worst possible moment, and I know that, and I will spend the rest of my life wishing I hadn't. You could say that. What you could not say was, I take it back, because it had happened and was in the world, and the world did not offer undo. Gerald did not want the sentence that was available. He wanted the sentence that made it not have happened. That sentence did not exist, and his 31 months of railing standing were in many ways the extended project of refusing to accept that it didn't exist, of continuing to search for it, of telling himself that when he found the right formulation, the call would go differently than any honest call could possibly go. On the night of the rain, the same October rain that Marcus had stood in, that Petra had been absorbed by, that Anthony had climbed to the outside of the railing in, Gerald went out at 11 p.m. and put his hands in the waiting prints and stood there. The prints were ahead of him before he arrived. The curtain shape was already fully defined in his reflection, had been fully defined, for months, was barely distinguishable from his own reflection in most lights. On nights when he was very tired, the two reflections, his and the thing's, overlapped almost completely, and he'd catch himself thinking that he didn't know which one was moving when, that the lag had gotten so small he couldn't measure it. On this night the lag was 0. He looked at his reflection in the rain-sheened rail, and the curtain shape was there and moving in perfect synchrony, not half a second behind, not any fraction behind, moving when he moved, holding when he held, breathing, or doing the thing that looked like breathing, at the exact rhythm of his chest. He had been practiced so thoroughly that the practice had become indistinguishable from the original. He thought, I should call Robert. The thought arrived in the register that all thoughts arrived in now, as something that had already been thought before, as a thought he was performing rather than having, as a thought that had been handed to him by something that knew he would have it and had prepared it in advance. He recognised it as his own thought, and also recognised that he'd been having it for so long, it had been absorbed into the building's repertoire, and now it arrived on schedule at the scheduled time, with the scheduled weight of sincerity that would lead to the scheduled feeling of meaning to call, and the scheduled decision to wait, and the scheduled return inside without having called. Except that Gerald was tired. Not tired like sleepy. Tired like a machine that has been running on the same cycle for so long that the parts are starting to fail. There was a quality of exhaustion in him that was past the kind that sleep cures, past the kind that a good meal cures, past the kind that a good conversation cures. It was the exhaustion of someone who has been rehearsing for 31 months, and whose body has started to lose the distinction between rehearsal and the thing. Rehearsal is supposed to prepare, you for. His hands were already in the position, were already gripped. The reflection in the rail was already where he was him, was the same, had no lag at all, moved when he moved, stopped when he stopped, looked where he looked. Gerald began to cry, which surprised him, because he had not cried at the funeral, had not cried when the argument ended with Robert hanging up, had not cried at any of the accumulation of moments that warranted it. He cried now, standing at the railing in the rain in his bathrobe, because he understood suddenly with a totality that didn't allow for any argument that 31 months was a long time to stand at a railing, and that the call that remained to be made was not going to get easier, and there was no sentence he could find in another 31 months that would make it easy, and that somewhere in the exercise of coming out here every night, and holding the rail, and going through the motions, he had stopped being someone who was deciding and had become someone who was being decided for. He took his hands off the rail, he put them on his chest, he felt his heartbeat and was surprised briefly that it was there. Strong. Old, but strong. His heart was 64 years old and it was still doing the work. He said out loud, I'm going to call him tomorrow morning, and then heard himself, the tomorrow landing in the wet air like a coin dropped in water. The ring of it. And Gerald, who had come outside every night for 31 months, who was more familiar with the mechanism of his own postponement than anyone in the building, except possibly whoever had been living in 4E a decade ago, and who the other tenants spoke of only carefully. Gerald heard the tomorrow and knew what it was, and closed his mouth around it and took another breath and replaced it. I'm going to call him when I go inside. Not tomorrow morning, not the upcoming week, when he went inside. He was going to pick up his phone, which was sitting on the kitchen counter where it sat every night, and he was going to call the number that was still in his contacts under Robert, with no last name because it had never needed a last name. It was just Robert. It had always just been Robert, and he was going to say, I said a terrible thing and I can't take it back, and I don't expect you to pretend I didn't say it, and I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to let me say I'm sorry, that's all. You can decide what to do with the rest of it. The prints ahead of him on the rail faded. The reflection resolved into just his reflection. Just Gerald, old and crying in a wet bathrobe, no second shape, no curtain thing, just the tired face of a man who had been not calling his son for nearly 3 years. He went inside. He called the number at 11:47 p.m. and it went to voicemail, and he left a message that was 43 seconds long and said most of what he'd intended to say, and trailed off at the end in a way that wasn't polished or perfectly composed, but was honest and his, and he hung up and stood in the kitchen and waited. Robert called back at 7:20 the next morning. They talked for 2 hours. The building did not give up easily. There are tenants who have been marked for long enough that a single night of doing it right is not sufficient to clear the debt. Petra Voss in 4F was one of these. She'd said tomorrow 3 times over the railing in the span of a month, and each time the rail had received it and filed it, and the curtain shape had sharpened and the path of prints had gotten more elaborate, had started appearing around corners, had started showing up in the apartment itself. No. That was later. That was after the 2nd October, after Petra had done the same thing for 12 more months without changing, after the balance had tipped from this person, sometimes delays to this person is defined by delay, after the building had finished learning her and had started running her. In the 2nd October, Petra went out to the balcony, and the prints were there before she touched the rail, and the rail was warm despite the weather, and her reflection in the metal was already tilted at the angle she would have tilted at after 30 minutes of standing, as though the building had skipped the preamble and started her halfway through the session. She put her hands in the warm prints and felt the fit and felt the thing that she no longer had words for. Recognition or consumption, something in that range. And she stood there for 90 minutes. She said tomorrow twice. She said maybe this weekend. She went inside and the cold followed her, which was new. The cold had always stayed outside before, had always released her at the door, had always been content to have her back at the railing tomorrow. Now it came inside with her, the specific cold of the metal, a cold that was not temperature but something that travelled in temperature as a medium. She felt it in her palms all the next day. She felt it in her sleep. She woke at 3 a.m. with her hands cramped around nothing, fingers curled as though gripping a bar, knuckles aching, and when she opened them slowly and lay them flat on the mattress, the feeling took 4 minutes to fade. In the morning, her handprints were on the inside of the window. She stood in the kitchen with her coffee and looked at the window over the sink, the window that faced the courtyard, that she looked out every morning, and there were 2 handprints on the glass, inside the apartment, at exactly the height her hands would be if she were leaning on the glass to look out, at exactly the spread of her hands, at exactly the angle, fresh, as if she'd pressed them there in the night. She hadn't pressed them there in the night. She hadn't been to that window. She stood in the kitchen looking at the prints on the glass and drank her coffee, and then got dressed and went to work and did not call her sister, and when she came home the prints were still there. She cleaned them off with a paper towel. They were back in the morning. Not the same prints exactly, these were slightly different, slightly further apart, as though the hand doing them had adjusted its grip, as though someone was practicing at it. Petra Voss began to sleep less, not by choice. She would go to bed at the usual time and lie in the dark, and her hands would ache, and she would drift towards sleep and find herself drifting instead toward the edge of the bed, toward the window, toward the courtyard-facing glass, and she would catch herself at the windowsill with both hands pressed against the lower pane, not remembering standing up, not remembering walking there, her body having gone to the window without her, having gone to practice the posture, having gone because the building needed the repetition, and had learned that asking wasn't sufficient. She called her sister on the 3rd night of waking at the window, not because she was ready, not because she'd found the perfect sentence, because she was standing at the window at 2:30 a.m. with both hands on the glass and her palms were warm on the cold surface, and she could see the courtyard below and the balcony railing 2 floors down reflected in the wet ground. And she understood with a clarity that bypassed analysis that the building was inside her house now, that the threshold between the place where she postponed and the place where she lived had been dissolved, and that she was going to make the call before she fell asleep again, or she was going to wake up at the railing without knowing how she got there. She called. The phone rang 6 times because it was 2:30 in the morning, and then her sister's voice came on, foggy with sleep and alarm, saying, "Petra, what?" And Petra said, "I borrowed money from you, and I didn't tell you I was struggling, and I didn't pay it back, and I have been not calling you about it for 14 months, and I'm calling you now because I don't know what else to do." And there was a silence, and then her sister said, "I know," and Petra said, "I'm sorry." And her sister said, "I know that too." They talked for an hour, not resolved. Money doesn't resolve in an hour, and the hurt of being avoided for 14 months doesn't dissolve in an hour, and some things were left for later conversations that hadn't happened yet and might take months to have fully. But the call was made, and it was honest, and when Petra finally went to bed at 4 a.m. her hands didn't ache, and she didn't drift toward the window, and she slept until 8 and woke clean. In the morning, the handprints on the inside of the window were gone. Simone in 6A took longer. Simone's postponement was different in character from the others. Not about money or a broken relationship or an overdue apology, but about fear in its purest and most sympathetic form. The fear of watching people you love prepare to be frightened for you. The specific, dreaded helplessness of becoming someone else's worry. The diagnosis wasn't cancer. It was something in the family of serious but manageable. A condition that would require surgery and monitoring and lifestyle changes. And that was, if caught early and treated well, very likely to result in a full and normal life. Her doctors were cautiously optimistic. Simone herself was not frightened of the diagnosis so much as she was frightened of the phone call, of the sound of her daughter's voices doing the thing voices do when they receive news they have to hold very still to accommodate, of being the source of that, of watching them rearrange their faces into expressions of calm support, while behind the expressions they were terrified. She didn't want to terrify them. That was all. It was a comprehensible motivation, and a generous one, and it was also an excuse, and she knew it was an excuse, and went out to the balcony anyway and stood at the 6th floor rail and rehearsed the conversation every night, and revised it every night, and found it insufficient every night, and told herself one more night of preparation would produce the version she could live with. The railing on the 6th floor had a different quality than the lower floors because of the height. Standing on the 6th floor, you were 40+ feet above the courtyard, and the courtyard below looked smaller, and the puddles in the rain looked like discs of mirror, and the drain was a sound you had to pay attention to catch. Simone liked the height. She found it clarifying, which was the worst possible recommendation for spending long nights standing at it. The curtain shape that developed in her reflection was different too, taller and more formal, as though it had absorbed the quality of someone trying to look competent and calm for an audience that hadn't arrived yet. It mimicked not her anxiety, but her performance of not being anxious. It had learned the face she put on for the call she wasn't making, had learned it better than she had, could do it with a consistency and commitment she herself could not maintain because she was not sure anymore what was underneath the performance. On the night that the building finished learning Simone, the prints on the railing began to form a pattern she didn't recognise at first. Not the usual forward path toward her thinking corner. This pattern was different. The prints on the rail formed a loop, returning to the same position, a circuit, as though her hands had been walking a track. The same 8 feet of rail covered again and again, in a pattern that suggested not rehearsal, but compulsion. A groove, the kind of pattern you make when you're not practicing a future action, but repeating a past one, when you've gone past intention and into ritual. Simone looked at the loop of prints and felt something go quiet in her chest. How long have I been out here, she thought, doing this same 8 feet? She looked at the courtyard. The rain was lighter tonight, more of a mist than a proper rain. She looked at her watch, which said 12:44 a.m, and calculated that she'd been outside since 10:15 p.m, and that the hour was later than she'd registered, that the cold was deeper than she'd noticed, that her hands on the rail were genuinely numb in the way that means you need to attend to this, not just discomfort, but the early stages of something medical. Her hands were numb, and she couldn't feel the railing, but she was still gripping it. She looked at the reflection. The curtain shape had done the thing it had done to Gerald, had synchronized, the lag reduced to nothing, moving with her in real time, indistinguishable from her reflection except in the thinness, the curtain quality, the sense of something present that doesn't occupy space quite correctly. And the curtain shape's hands in the reflection were also on the rail, also gripping, also not feeling anything. Simone said, out loud to the mist, to the sleeping courtyard, to whoever was awake in any of the lit windows, "I'm sick." 2 words, true words, not the full version, not the specific diagnosis and the specific surgery and the specific prognosis. Just the 2 words that she'd been not saying, because saying them made them real, and made them hers, and made them information that needed to be held by people who loved her. And she'd been protecting those people from the holding, and she was 67 years old and had spent enough of her life protecting people from difficult information to know that protection was not always protection. She said, "I'm sick and I'm going to call my daughters in the morning." She caught the morning. She took a breath. "I'm going to call them when I go inside." She released the railing. The numbness released slowly, sensation returning to her palms in the painful way sensation returns, prickling and specific. She put her hands on her chest, felt the warmth, felt the heartbeat, which was fine, which was her heart doing the job it had always done. Her reflection in the clearing mist was just her reflection. She went inside and called both daughters on a conference call at 12:54 a.m. and said the true words in the true order, quietly and without performance, and listened to their voices doing exactly what she'd known they'd do. That particular quality of holding very still while receiving difficult news, and then heard what came after, which she'd somehow failed to anticipate, which was that they didn't panic, that they were concerned and steady and immediately practically about what happens next, what do the doctors say, what are the options, when is the surgery, we'll be there. We'll be there. She hadn't anticipated that. She'd been so focused on the receiving of the news that she'd stopped the imagination before it got to the part where her daughters showed her who they were. They came up from their respective cities the following weekend, and they all went to one of their medical appointments together, and stood in the fluorescent light of the doctor's office, and asked sensible questions and held hands. In the parking lot afterward, and went to a decent restaurant for an early dinner, and Simone sat across from the two of them, and thought that she had wasted 4 months of this for a fear that turned out to be a misunderstanding of who her daughters were. The building was patient. It was always going to be patient. It had been built on human delay, and human delay was not in short supply. There would always be new tenants with new unfinished conversations and new rehearsal sessions and new tomorrow speeches. The building would learn them. The railing would record them. The curtain thing would practice them until they were indistinguishable from the originals. But the building had its own geometry, and the geometry had a centre. The centre was the 4th floor, not 4F, where the couple fought, and not 4E, where Petra had her window problem, but the unit that faced directly onto the courtyard, that had the balcony with the best and worst view of the ground below, 4C. 4C had been empty for 7 years, not because it was a bad unit, because the Vanthorpe management had stopped renting it after the last tenant. They kept it on the books as undergoing renovation, which it had been undergoing for 7 years without any visible renovation taking place. The neighbours on either side had stopped questioning it. The super, a quiet man named Estives, who had been with the building for 23 years, kept the key to 4C on a separate ring from the other keys and did not use it unless he absolutely had to, and when he did not go out onto the balcony, and he did not stay long, and he locked the unit carefully behind him and moved quickly down the hall. The last tenant of 4C had been a woman named Lenora Marsh. She'd lived there for 9 years. She'd been a grade school teacher, retired, who'd moved to the Vanthorpe after her husband's death to be closer to her daughter's family in the city. She'd been a quietly social presence in the building, the kind of person who notices things and remembers them, who knows which neighbour has a new medication they're nervous about, and which one has a job interview coming up and asks about it afterward. She had also had a thing she wasn't saying. Specifically, she had been writing a book for 30 years. A memoir about her childhood during a particular period of history. A childhood that contained things she had never told her daughter. Things about her parents' choices during a political period that was difficult to navigate with dignity. Choices that had kept the family safe but had required accommodations she'd spent her adult life not knowing how to discuss. The book existed as 400 pages of typed manuscript in a box under the bed in 4C. She had been writing it for 30 years, and she had been revising it for 20, and she had been finished with it for 11, and she had been deciding to send it to her daughter for 11 years, and had not. The tomorrow speeches she gave from the balcony of 4Cs were the most elaborate in the building's history. Not the longest. Gerald's 31 months topped that in duration, but the most detailed, the most rehearsed, the most polished in their language. She was a writer. She rehearsed the speech with a craftsperson's attention to cadence and word choice, and the strategic placement of the moment when she'd reveal what the book contained. She'd given herself notes on the speech. She'd revised the notes. She'd been doing this for 9 years from the balcony of 4C. When Lenora Marsh died, she died in the apartment rather than the hospital, which was her wish, a quiet death in her own bed early on a November morning, with her daughter holding her hand, which she had called to come 2 days before the end when she'd finally understood the end was coming. She had not given her daughter the manuscript. The box remained under the bed. Her daughter, a woman named Clara, competent and grieving, handled the estate and found the box and opened it and read the first 40 pages standing in the empty apartment in 4C, and sat down on the floor against the wall and read another 60 pages sitting there, and then closed the box and sat with it in her lap for a long time. Clara had understood. She'd gone back for the rest of the box and she'd taken it home, and she'd read the whole 400 pages over 2 weeks, and had spent a long time afterward deciding what she thought about the things the book contained, the accommodations her grandparents had made, the specific texture of her mother's silence about it, and what Clara decided, eventually after the time it deserved, was that the book should exist in the world. She found a small publisher. The book came out 3 years after Lenora's death. Clara wrote the preface, but that was after. That was outside the building. That was the thing Lenora had been rehearsing for 9 years becoming real by a different route than the one she'd planned, through death rather than courage, through her daughter's judgment rather than her own. In 4C, after Lenora, the balcony rail had 9 years of her in it. 9 years of a very specific and very developed postponement. The curtain shape that had learned Lenora was the most complete the building had ever produced. It had her gait, had the weight distribution of a woman in her late 60s, had the particular tilt of a person who spent 30 years hunching over a typewriter. It had the posture of someone holding 400 pages of truth that she'd decided to give to tomorrow. It was still there, in the empty apartment, on the empty balcony. Steves had seen it once. On the one occasion he'd had to go in to check a plumbing complaint from the unit above. He'd been standing in the living room and it had been raining, and he'd looked at the glass door to the balcony and seen the shape at the rail, the right size, the right hunch, the particular stillness of long practice, and he'd stood very still in the living room for 4 seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than he'd ever intended to stay, and then he'd done what he'd learned to do over 23 years of working in a building that had developed memory. He'd gone to the glass door and knocked on it. 3 knocks, firm. The knock of someone who knows what they're interrupting and intends to interrupt it anyway. The shape at the rail had turned. He thought it had turned. He'd tell you he thought it had turned if you asked him directly, though he wouldn't go into detail. And then it was not there, and the railing was just wet metal catching the light from the courtyard below. And Steves checked the plumbing and left promptly and locked the door and put the key back on the separate ring and went home and told no one. The night Marcus Hale told Elena the 6 words was a Friday. He woke her at 11:30 p.m. because he'd lain in bed for an hour and a half trying to let himself fall asleep, and his chest had felt like something was sitting on it, and he'd known, not with drama, just with clarity, that the clarity he'd found on the balcony was going to last until morning, and then was going to do what clarity always does in the morning, which is find reasons to soften, find reasons to wait, find reasons to let the day's ordinary demands absorb the urgency until it came back next time, slightly smaller. He sat on the edge of the bed and said her name, and she came up from sleep slowly and looked at him. And before she could be alarmed at the hour or the expression, he said the 6 words. She lay there with them. Then she said, "I know." He looked at her. "I've known for about 8 months," she said. "I've been waiting for you to figure out how to say it." The conversation that followed was 2 hours long, and ran the full range of things that conversation runs: grief and anger and strange relief and practical logistics, and one long stretch of silence in the dark that was not hostile but was the silence of 2 people, processing the end of something that had been real and was now also over. They both cried, at different points, separately. They didn't hold each other, which would have been the wrong comfort for the wrong reason. They sat on their respective sides of the bed in the dark and talked until 1:30 a.m. when Eleanor said she needed to sleep, and Marcus moved to the couch and lay there looking at the ceiling and felt something that was not happiness, but was the specific relief of a person who's been carrying a rehearsed speech for too long and has finally put it down. The balcony was just a balcony now. He went out once more in the next week, for air, out of habit, and stood at the rail and thought nothing in particular, and the rail was cold metal and the courtyard was the ordinary courtyard, and the rain that came while he stood there was just rain, and he went back inside when he got cold. The building had not lost anything exactly. It still had Gerald, partially. Gerald had made the call, and had been talking to Robert for weeks now, carefully in the early stages of something that might become a real reconciliation, and might become a different and more honest version of a relationship that had been performing its old form for too long. But Gerald still went out to the balcony. Old habits. He went out and the railing was just railing, and the prints that appeared were just prints from his own hands, and there was nothing in the reflection but himself. He went out because he liked the air, and because 31 months of habit doesn't dissolve in 3 weeks, and because there was still something clarifying about the cold and the dark, and he'd been coming to terms with the fact that maybe that was just him, maybe that was just who he was, someone who processed things with cold metal and rain and height, and that was fine. That was a thing about himself he could keep. Danny and 5C sent the preemptive email to her manager on a Wednesday, and it had not gone perfectly. The manager had called her in. There had been a conversation about performance that was difficult and honest and not fun, but she had been the one to name it first, had been the one to say, "I know the numbers aren't where they should be, and here's what I think is happening." And the conversation that followed had been hard in the way that things are hard when they're real, and not in the way that things are hard when they've been managed into something that bypasses the actual problem. The performance plan they drafted was achievable, and the manager, it turned out, had been worried about Danny in a way that was supportive rather than punitive, had been waiting for Danny to signal she knew. Danny still went out to the balcony, but she went for cigarettes now rather than rehearsals, which was a worse habit medically but a healthier one psychologically, or at least that's what she told herself, and the rail was just a place to rest her arm while she smoked. The building processed these departures the way it processed everything, without urgency, without sentiment, without any indication that it had noticed. It had other tenants. It had the couple in 4F, who were still circling the same 5 grievances, and whose postponements were not the balcony-standing kind, but the internal kitchen argument kind. The kind where both parties know the real grievance, and neither one names it because naming it would require one of them to be the first to say something true, and whoever is first is more exposed. The building had learned 4F's rhythm. It would wait. It had a new tenant coming to 7B, who had moved from out of state following something, whose boxes had arrived on Thursday, while the rain was still falling. The new tenant was quiet, had shaken Esteves's hand in the lobby without saying much, had stood at the window of the empty apartment looking at the courtyard for a long moment before beginning to unpack. The new tenant had something in the set of the jaw, in the stillness of the looking that Esteves recognised. He'd shaken the new tenant's hand and said, "The balconies are nice, good views, but be careful on the rails in the rain, they can get slippery." The new tenant had nodded. The thing Balconshade kept, when you postpone the truth, was simply you, or the version of you that was made of habit rather than choice. The you that had been practiced into existence by repetition, the you that existed in the lean and the grip and the long cold patience of a person standing at a railing deciding to wait one more night. It didn't take bodies. It didn't want them. Bodies were too conclusive, too final, produced too much loud disruption in the courtyard below, made Esteves call emergency services, brought police tape and counsellors and building management investigations, and neighbours pressing their faces to their windows and asking questions. Bodies ended stories. Balconshade was not interested in ending stories. It was interested in the specific, precise, ongoing quality of a story that had been suspended at the moment of almost saying, held in the condition of about to be said, kept in the state of perpetual imminence. What it kept was the tomorrow as a permanent condition, the tomorrow that never became today, the handprints appearing ahead on the rail, always ahead, always in the spots where your hands were going to go before you went there, the path laid out before you walked it. Your posture practiced in the metal reflection until the reflection knew you better than you knew yourself, knew how you leaned when you were working up to the hardest sentence, knew the specific quality of stillness in a person who has been about to say something for 3 years and still hasn't. Balconshade didn't push you over the railing, it just kept you on the outside of it, standing on the narrow ledge between the life you had and the life that required the hard sentence, with your hands behind you gripping the bar and the whole drop in front of you, and the building pressed warm against your back, practicing your grip, practicing your lean, practicing the shape of someone who will definitely say the true thing tomorrow. Definitely. Tomorrow, when they find the right words, when the moment is right, when they're ready. You were always so close to being ready. The building knew how to wait. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The rain had been falling for 6 hours by the time Mara reached the subway entrance on Delancey Street, and it wasn't the gentle kind of rain that city people learn to ignore. It was the kind that came in sideways sheets, that found the gap between your collar and your neck and ran cold fingers down your spine, that turned the gutters into fast brown rivers carrying cigarette butts and crushed paper cups and the occasional lost shoe toward drains that couldn't keep up. The kind of rain that made the whole city smell like a basement. Wet concrete and iron and something underneath both of those things. Something older. Something that had been sitting in the dark long enough to develop its own personality. She stood at the top of the stairs and didn't go down. This wasn't unusual for her. Standing at the top of things and not going down. Standing at the edge of decisions and not making them. Her therapist, the one she'd stopped seeing 8 months ago because she kept cancelling. Appointments. and eventually it felt more embarrassing to reschedule than to just quietly disappear, had a word for it. Several words actually arranged into careful clinical sentences that Mara had nodded at, and then driven home thinking about what she was going to eat for dinner instead of absorbing. Avoidant, that was one of the words. Avoidant with dissociative tendencies in high-stress threshold situations. Threshold situations. She'd laughed about that one, alone in her car, the therapist's building already 3 blocks behind her. Threshold situations. As if her whole life hadn't become one long threshold situation. A permanent residency at the edge of the diving board. The water far below always the exact temperature of the decision she couldn't make. The subway entrance breathed up at her. That was the only word for it. The warm, stale air that rose from underground hit her face like an exhale, carrying with it that signature underground smell, hot metal and rubber, and the ghost of a million bodies, and underneath all of that, tonight, because of the rain, something else. Something wet and mineral and alive. The entrance smelled like the inside of a mouth. Mara pulled her jacket tighter and looked down the stairs. The fluorescent lights at the bottom were doing something she'd never noticed before, which was probably just a function of the rain and the hour. It was past midnight, the streets nearly empty, the city in that strange suspended state between last call and first light where everything feels slightly unreal, but the lights seemed to pulse, not flicker, pulse, like something breathing. She'd come here because her apartment was 11 blocks north and she wasn't ready to go back to it. This was the honest version of the reason, the one she admitted to herself standing in the rain rather than the other versions she'd been cycling through for the past 40 minutes of walking. The other versions were, I need to get somewhere, I'm just stretching my legs. I like the rain, I wanted fresh air. All of those were technically true the way that a skeleton is technically a person, the right structure, none of the substance. The real reason was that her apartment contained a box she'd been not opening for 3 weeks. The box was on her kitchen table. It was not a large box, it was in fact a fairly small box, the kind you'd use to ship a hardcover book, roughly that size and shape. And it had arrived on a Tuesday and she had put it on the kitchen table, and she'd not touched it since except to move it once, briefly, to wipe something up, and then replace it in exactly the same spot as if she were conducting an extremely careful archaeology of her own avoidance. The box was from her mother, who she hadn't spoken to in 4 years. Her mother, from whom she'd received, across those 4 years, a total of 11 letters, 3 birthday cards, 2 Christmas cards, and now 1 box. Her mother, who lived in a house in New Mexico with a man named Dale that Mara had met twice and didn't like, not because of anything Dale had done, but because of what his presence there implied, that her mother had replaced the family she'd broken with a new and apparently more satisfying arrangement, and had done so without apparent difficulty or guilt. Her mother who, when Mara had finally, after years of therapy and one very hard night and several drafts, told her what life in that house had been like, had said, "You always were sensitive. You always were sensitive." 3 weeks, the box had been sitting there. 3 weeks of making coffee and eating cereal standing up to avoid sitting at the table. 3 weeks of doing her laptop work on the couch. 3 weeks of occasionally standing in the kitchen doorway looking at the box and thinking, tomorrow I'll open it, tomorrow I'll deal with it. By next week I'll have dealt with it. By the end of the month I'll have moved on, tomorrow next. Week. Soon. Eventually. The box sat in its spot and accumulated the weight of all those tomorrows, and now it was so heavy with postponed reckoning that Mara genuinely believed, in the irrational but deeply felt way that the body believes things the mind can't quite authorize, that if she opened it, something inside her might crack along a fault line she'd spent years carefully not pressing. So she was standing at the top of a subway entrance at midnight in the rain instead. The stairs went down at a standard angle, 12 steps, the iron railing running along the right side with its coating of old black paint worn silver at the grip points by 10,000 hands. The bottom of the stairs opened into the turnstile area, and from where she stood she could see the machines lined up in their row. 4 of them. 2 standard turnstiles with the rotating bars, 1 wide gate for accessibility, 1 emergency exit door with its push bar permanently warning "Do not enter." The fare readers on each machine were small rectangular screens mounted at shoulder height, glowing that particular blue-white of transit infrastructure, a colour that had no equivalent anywhere in nature, because it had been specifically engineered to be visible in dim light, and had in the process become something inhuman, a colour that belonged only in basements and hospitals and the insides of machines. Rain was coming down the stairs, not a lot of it, a thin sheet running down the centre of each step, turning the slightly recessed drain channel in the middle into a small moving river. The water collected at the bottom and ran into a drain she couldn't see from where she stood, and the sound of it, a soft, continuous rushing, barely audible, mixed with the sound of the rain behind her and the distant mechanical hum from below, and made the entrance sound like something alive, something with a circulatory system, something with pipes instead of veins. Mara thought, I'm not even going anywhere. She thought this the way you think. The obvious thing you've been avoiding thinking when you're tired enough that your mental defences get sloppy. She wasn't going anywhere. She had no destination. There was no train she needed to catch, no friend waiting for her on a platform, no errand that required transit at this hour. She'd walked here because walking had felt like motion, and motion had felt like the opposite of the box on the kitchen table, and the opposite of the box felt like relief. But she was standing at the top of the subway stairs, and below her was just more city, just more underground fluorescence and wet tile, and the smell of hot metal, and the sound of trains running between places she wasn't actually going. She was going to go down anyway. She recognised this about herself even as she stood there. The decision had already been made somewhere beneath the level of conscious thought, in the part of her that preferred motion to stillness and the illusion of purpose to the confrontation of its absence. She was going to walk down these stairs, and she was going to tap her card, and she was going to get on a train and ride it somewhere and then ride it back, and none of that was going to change anything about the box on the kitchen table, and she knew this, and she was going to do it anyway. She took the first step down. The iron railing was cold and wet. Her hand closed around it and immediately regretted the temperature but didn't let go. The rain stopped hitting the top of her head as she descended, and was replaced by the close mineral smell of the stairwell, that concentrated subway exhale of hot metal and electricity, and something she'd never been able to name precisely, but which always reminded her of old copper pennies held in a closed fist, the smell of metal warmed by friction and current and time. The fluorescent light at the bottom grew larger as she descended, the shadows shortened and the sound of the rain above her diminished and was replaced by the low omnipresent hum of the underground, a vibration as much felt as heard, something that entered through the soles of the feet and the palms of the hands, and lived in the chest for a moment before the body normalised it. The bottom step. The drain in the floor was doing its job mostly. There was a thin film of water across the tile. Terracotta-coloured concrete. Decades of it. The grout lines dark with compressed grime. And her shoes found it immediately, the soles breaking the surface tension and sending a thin spray of cold water across the toe of her left shoe. The turnstiles were in front of her. She'd passed through turnstiles 10,000 times, 20,000 times. She'd lived in this city for 9 years and used the subway with the mindless regularity of someone who had fully integrated transit into their body's automatic processes. It was as thoughtless as swallowing, as habitual as blinking. She reached into her jacket pocket for her Metro card. Actual card, not phone app. She'd never gotten around to switching, even though they kept warning that the cards were being phased out. And she held it loosely in her right hand, and she walked toward the middle turnstile, the one directly ahead. Because of those 3 standard machines, it was the one that looked most recently serviced, its screen brightest, its metal casing least dented. She was 4 steps away when she stopped. Not because she decided to stop. Her feet simply stopped moving. The way your body sometimes catches something before your mind does, some low-level threat assessment running below consciousness, some animal part of the brain that still understood that hesitation at thresholds could mean the difference between safety and harm. She stood there with her Metro card in her hand and 4 feet of wet tile, between herself and the turnstile, and she didn't move. The fare screen on the middle turnstile was glowing. She looked at it. The screen was displaying the normal thing, the tap icon, the small circular animation indicating the reader was active, the fare amount in the corner. This was completely standard. This was what fare screens did. She looked at it the way you look at something ordinary that has begun, through no identifiable change in itself, to feel not ordinary at all, the way a familiar word will sometimes stop meaning itself if you stare at it long enough and become just marks on a surface. She took a step toward it. The screen flickered, just once. A brief interruption in the display, a flash of something else. She couldn't read it in the fraction of a second it was visible, couldn't decode it into specific letters or words, only had the impression of text, the visual weight of words, the sense that something had been written there. And then the normal display returned, patient and bright. Mara stood in front of the fare reader with her card raised. She didn't tap it. She was thinking about the flicker. She was thinking about the way the underground air had changed very slightly in the last 30 seconds. It was colder, definitely colder, with a wet quality that reminded her of the rain above but deeper, as if the cold had been down here a long time and had developed a density. She was thinking about the sound, which was... She tilted her head slightly, listening, the small unconscious gesture of a person trying to isolate an audio signal. There was a sound she hadn't noticed before, a regular sound, coming from the turnstile itself, from the mechanism inside the housing, a soft electronic tone, evenly spaced. Beep, a pause, beep. She counted the pauses, 1 second between each tone, roughly. She counted them 3 times to confirm, 1 second, 1 second, 1 second. Then she counted them again, and this time she was aware of her own heartbeat. She'd become suddenly, uncomfortably aware of it, the way you do when something startles you enough to make you conscious of your body, and her heartbeat was beep, her heartbeat, beep, her heartbeat, beep, her heartbeat. The sound was not 1 second apart. She'd miscounted or misperceived, because what she'd heard as 1 second was not 1 second at all. It was her own pulse, her own resting heart rate, 62 beats per minute at rest, and more now, because she was standing in a cold subway station with rain in her hair, and something was wrong, something was... Beep! Her heart lurched, and the beeping lurched with it, skipping the same half-beat, recovering at the same moment, and Mara felt the hair on her arm stand up with a slow, deliberate, horrible certainty. She stepped back. 2 steps. Her heel caught the wet tile, and she nearly went down but caught the railing of the next turnstile with one hand, the metal cold and unforgiving against her palm, and she steadied herself and stood there breathing, and the beeping. The beeping continued matching her, continued timing itself to her, continued being wrong, continued being exactly as wrong as it had been, calm about it, patient about it, as if it had been doing this for years and she had only now noticed. The screen flickered again. This time she was looking directly at it, and the flicker lasted longer. Not long. Not more than a second, but long enough. And she read it. 2 words, clear as anything. As if they'd been arranged there not incidentally but specifically, arranged for her, arranged because someone or something that lived inside Fair Collection infrastructure had looked at her and found her specific species of damage and translated it into display text. Not yet. Then the normal screen, the tap icon, the circular animation, the fair amount, everything correct, everything mechanical, everything completely ordinary. Mara's legs were shaking. She was aware of this distantly, the way you're aware of things the body is doing when the mind has temporarily checked out of the body and is operating from somewhere slightly outside it. Her legs were shaking and the card was still in her hand and the beeping was still. Beep, her pulse, beep. She looked up. The sensor lights along the top of the turnstile housing, small LEDs, 2 of them, 1 on each side, usually a flat functionless green, were not flat and functionless. They were tracking her. She watched them. As she shifted her weight to her left foot and leaned fractionally in that direction, the lights shifted, a minute movement, the nearly imperceptible orientation of something that was paying attention. When she leaned back, they followed, small, deliberate, the movement of eyes, not the movement of sensors responding to proximity. She knew what that looked like, the dumb mechanical sweep of a motion-activated device. This was different. This had the quality of interest. The wet tile floor reflected the turnstile's glow, and in the reflection, she looked down at it. In the reflection, the image of herself looked different. It took her a moment to understand why, and then she understood. In the reflection, she was already on the other side of the turnstile. Her reflection stood in the space beyond the gate, in the corridor that led to the platforms, and was facing away from her, walking away from her, as if her reflection had already made the decision her actual body was still dithering over. Her actual feet were planted on this side of the gate. But in the water-blurred reflection on the tile, she was already through, already going. She made a sound, not quite a word, a short, soft, involuntary sound, a syllable of pure startlement, and immediately covered her mouth with the hand that wasn't holding the Metro card. Don't say anything. Some part of her understood, with a directness and clarity that was unusual for her. given that most of her understanding came wrapped in layers of qualification and doubt, and wait, let me think about this. Don't make requests. Don't ask for anything. Don't say out loud what you're afraid of, because whatever is in there, whatever is calibrated to the exact frequency of your hesitation, whatever has been listening to your heart rate, whatever made your reflection walk away without you, it is listening for a specific kind of sound. It is waiting for the specific sentence. Just let me through. She could feel the sentence in her throat, the exact shape of it, the exact weight. It was the sentence she'd wanted to say to 100 thresholds, in 100 doorways, at the edge of 100 decisions. Standing outside her mother's house the last time she'd been there, 4 years ago, the argument still happening inside, the door closed against her. Standing outside the door of a classroom the day she'd been supposed to defend her dissertation chapter and hadn't gone in. Standing outside Marcus's apartment the night she'd gone to end things and had knocked and then heard him moving inside and had left before he opened it without explanation, leaving him to construct whatever story his mind preferred for why she'd been gone when he opened the door. Just let me through. Just let me get to the other side of this without feeling it. Just let the gate decide so I don't have to. The beeping quickened. She was breathing faster. Her heart rate was up. The beeping tracked it exactly, faithfully, with a devotion that was more frightening than any malice would have been. Malice she could have pushed against. This felt like something worse. This felt like being witnessed. Mara became aware of something in her peripheral vision. She'd learned, over years of anxiety, not to trust peripheral vision. The peripheral visual field was where the brain projected its own noise, its own generated content, especially in high-stress states. You saw movement that wasn't there, shapes in shadows, people in empty rooms. She'd spent a lot of energy over the years talking herself down from peripheral hallucinations, learning the cognitive technique of turning directly toward the thing you thought you'd seen and confirming its absence, and the comfort of that confirmation had become a small, reliable tool in her kit. She didn't want to turn directly toward this one. It was to her right, in the space between the second and third turnstile, which was a space of maybe 18 inches, enough for a person to stand in if they were very thin, and the thing in her peripheral vision was very thin. It occupied the full height of that space, ceiling to floor roughly, or it implied it did, the way a shape in low light implies its full dimensions even when you can't confirm them. It was pale. It had the pale quality of something that had been deprived of light for a long time. Not white exactly, but the colour of things that should have colour and don't. Bleached out, transit paper pale, the colour of the tape they used to mark floors in transit corridors. It had no clear features, or rather, it had the suggestion of features, thus the arrangement of a face, the posture of a body, the way a very close look at old static on a screen will sometimes arrange into a face before your brain admits it's nothing. It stood perfectly still. It didn't breathe. It didn't shift weight. It had the stillness of something that didn't need to perform aliveness, because it was interested in something other than life. The air around the turnstile was significantly colder than the air anywhere else in the station. Mara's eyes were filling with water. She realised she hadn't blinked in. She didn't know how long. Long enough. She blinked, and the peripheral shape didn't change. She blinked again, and it still didn't change. She forced herself not to look at it directly, the same energy she used to not look at the box on her kitchen table, the same focused peripheral containment, keeping it in the space where it could be denied. The fare screen flickered. Almost, it said, and then should have, and then too late. Each word held for less than a second, cycling through the words the way a destination board cycles through stops. But these weren't stops. These were, she recognised them with a lurch of something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite recognition. A third thing, a thing that lived in the place where fear and recognition overlapped and became personal. These were her words, her specific words. The words she heard in her own internal monologue when she was standing at thresholds, the vocabulary of her postponement, the language of a person who had made a practice of arriving at decisions just slightly too late. Almost called, should have stayed. Too late to fix, almost left, should have gone. Too late now. The beeping was a metronome now, her heart, the machine's tone, the two indistinguishable from each other, a single organism of hesitation, and she thought wildly, irrationally. If it's matching me, then if I slow my heart rate down, it'll slow down. If I breathe slowly enough, if I can just calm down enough to breathe slowly, I can separate my rhythm from its rhythm, and then they won't be the same thing anymore. And then she breathed in slowly. The beeping slowed. She breathed out slowly. The beeping slowed further. Something dripped from the ceiling and hit the floor near the drain with a soft, flat sound that was perfectly ordinary. The sound of a building processing rainwater. And Mara used that sound, that completely ordinary sound, as an anchor. Ceiling, water, rain above, ordinary infrastructure doing ordinary things. She was in a subway station at midnight in the rain. She was a person who had walked here from her apartment 11 blocks north. She was a woman who had a MetroCard in her hand, and who was standing in front of a turnstile because she'd wanted the illusion of going somewhere, and none of this was... The screen showed her name, just her name. In the font of the Transit Authority, in the same blue-white as everything else, her name where the fair amount usually sat. Mara. Capitalised, transit clean, like a destination, like a station that might or might not still be running. Mara. Her card was in her hand, she hadn't tapped it. She hadn't tapped it, and her name was on the screen and the sensor lights were tracking her, and the beeping was matching her heartbeat, and the pale thing in the gap between the machines was standing completely still, and Mara thought, with a clarity and a steadiness that surprised her given everything, step back. She took a step back, one step, deliberate, unhurried, the way you step back from something hot, not running, not panicking, just creating distance, recognizing the heat. The beeping stuttered. It lost its rhythm for a moment, that single step disrupting the synchrony, and in the disruption she could hear the difference between the machine's sound and the sound of her own blood, and they were not the same. They were not the same frequency. They had been close, been tuned to each other, but they were not the same thing, and they never had been, and she was not the machine, and the machine was not her, and the gate was just a gate. She held her card over the reader and did not tap it. She held it at the distance of tapping, her hand 2 inches from the screen's glow touching her knuckles, and she held it there in the attitude of a tap, in the posture and position of a payment being made, but she did not make it. She offered the pause, the silence of the tap, the intention without the completion, a breath that said, I see you, and I am not giving you what you want. She didn't know where she'd learned to do this. She hadn't known she knew until her body did it. The screen went dark for a moment. Not off. Dark. The way a face goes when it loses interest. Then the ordinary display returned. Tap icon. Animation. Fair amount. Her name was gone. The screen was just a screen. She became aware that she was shaking. Not her legs this time, her whole body. A fine, persistent tremor. The kind that comes after adrenaline starts to metabolize. The body recognizing that something has passed without having been entirely sure, while it was passing, that it would. She was breathing. That was good. She was breathing, and her feet were on this side of the gate and her card was in her hand, and she hadn't said anything, hadn't asked for anything, hadn't whispered the sentence. The beeping stopped, not gradually, just stopped. The way a sound stops when a door closes between you and it. Complete cessation. The ambient noise of the station resumed around her. The distant mechanical hum, the sound of rain at the top of the stairs, water hitting the drain somewhere, the faint seismic vibration of a train running on a different line far below. And all of it was noise now, just the building doing its building things, just the system processing the city's late-night logistics. She lowered her hand, put the MetroCard in her pocket. She looked at the sensor lights. They were green, flat and green and pointing forward, indifferent, doing their simple sensor thing, caring nothing about her or her history of thresholds, or her box of postponements, or her mother or Marcus, or the chapter she'd never defended. She looked at the space between the second and third turnstile. Empty. She looked at the floor. The reflection was just a reflection, herself standing where she was standing, seen from below and at an angle. Nothing through the gate, just her own tired face and wet hair, and the jacket she'd bought 2 years ago, meaning to return it and then never had. She turned and walked toward the stairs. The first step up felt effortful, the way first steps feel after you've been stationary long enough for your body to start doubting the possibility of movement. Her hand found the railing automatically. Cold iron, wet with the rain running down from the street. The metal worn silver at the grip by every hand that had made this climb, and she gripped it hard and she went up. Second step, third. She was aware of the impulse. Even now, with her back to it, even climbing, even escaping, or whatever this was, she was aware of the magnetic pull to look back down, to see if it was still there, to confirm or deny, to get one more look at the fair screen, just to see if it was normal, just for the reassurance of normal, and she knew that knowing was the trap. The need for confirmation was the trap. That looking back was how you ended up looking back forever, your eyes dragging you backward toward the threshold, your curiosity doing the work the gate couldn't do directly. She looked up. She looked at the rectangle of open air at the top of the stairs, the street, the rain, the orange-brown of wet city night sky, the black iron of the railing ending at street level, and above it all the rain continuing to fall, pointlessly and persistently, onto a city that neither needed it nor particularly wanted it, but was getting it anyway. She looked at that and she kept climbing. 9th step. 10th. The rain hit her face before she was fully out of the stairwell, the cold of it a shock, and then immediately a relief. The specific relief of sensation that belongs to the above-ground world, to weather and wind and the open sky. Sensation that has context and cause and doesn't know her name. She came up out of the station and the rain was everywhere, coming down steadily onto the empty street, running along the curb, filling a pothole 20 feet away to make a small brown lake, and she stood at the top of the stairs and tilted her face up and let it fall on her. She stood like that for a moment. Then she put her hands in her pockets, and she walked. She walked north, back the way she'd come, 11 blocks in the rain, past the bodega with its light on and its display of cut flowers going slightly limp in the wet air, past the laundromat with its windows fogged from the dryers running even at this hour, past the bar she'd been to once with a group of people she'd been trying to make friends with and hadn't quite managed, hadn't quite crossed the distance from acquaintance to friend, had left early with a vague excuse and come home to sit in her kitchen and think, next time I'll stay longer, next time I'll be better at it, past all of it, through the rain. At the entrance to her building she stopped and found her keys. The key for the front door was on a separate ring from the key for her apartment, and she'd been meaning to combine them for. She didn't think about how long she'd been meaning to combine them. She unlocked the front door and went in. The elevator took 40 seconds. She counted them. Her floor, her hallway. The specific institutional smell of her building's carpet, slightly damp tonight because the rain had come in somewhere, under the exterior door or through a window in the stairwell, a smell of old wool and concrete. She found her apartment key and she put it in the lock, and she turned it and she opened the door. Her apartment was dark and warm and smelled like her, like the candles she burned sometimes and the specific shampoo she used, and the food she'd been making for herself lately, and underneath all of it the old building smell of plaster and wood that had been here long before her and would be here long after. She turned on the kitchen light. The box was on the table. Same spot, same box, same 3 weeks of accumulated tomorrow sitting on top of it, invisible and crushing. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her wet jacket dripping on the floor, and she looked at the box for a long time. Then she crossed the kitchen. She didn't let herself stop. She moved with the same deliberateness she'd used on the stairs, the same quality of just keep going that had gotten her up out of the subway and through the rain, and through 11 blocks of city. She moved toward the box the way she'd moved away from the turnstile, as if the trick was the same, as if all thresholds had the same mechanics, as if knowing the mechanism changed what the mechanism could do to you. She pulled out a chair. She sat down. She put both hands flat on the top of the box for a moment, feeling the cardboard slightly soft from the ambient humidity, feeling the small dent where she'd lifted and replaced it, the slight roughness of the tape. She opened it. She didn't stop. She didn't think tomorrow. She didn't think almost. She worked the tape up with her thumbnail and she folded back the top flaps, and she looked at what was inside. It was a photograph. Not loose. Framed. A small frame. The cheap kind with the cardboard backing and the thin metal edging. The kind you buy at a drugstore when you want to put something on a surface and call it displayed. The photograph was of Mara and her mother, and it had been taken. She calculated this immediately and involuntarily, the way the mind dates photographs by hair and clothing, and the specific quality of the light, sometime around when Mara was 7 or 8 years old. They were at a beach. Both of them were wet. Her mother was laughing, really laughing, the full-body kind that had always been rare from her, and she had her arm around young Mara, who was also laughing, who was laughing with her whole face, and they were both soaked, and it appeared to be a perfect day. Mara did not remember this day. This was the thing that hit her. Sitting in her kitchen at midnight with her wet jacket still on and rain dripping from her onto the floor, she did not remember this day. She could not locate it in her memory of childhood. It wasn't that the memory was painful or suppressed. It simply didn't exist in her archive. She had no record of this laughing-soaked woman as the person she remembered. No memory that connected that easy full-body laugh to the careful, collected silence that her mother had more characteristically inhabited. And yet here was the photograph. Here was the evidence of a moment that had existed and that she had been inside and that had entirely vacated her. There was a note underneath the photograph, a small index card. Her mother's handwriting, which she recognised immediately, and which hit her somewhere below the sternum with the force of all the specific muscle memory of childhood. Report cards signed, permission slips, grocery lists left on counters. It said, in her mother's careful cursive, "I found this. I thought you should have it. I'm sorry it took me so long to know what sorry means. Mom." Mara sat in her kitchen and looked at that for a long time. She did not cry, not right away. She sat with the photograph and the note and the empty box and the particular quality of midnight that allows you to sit with things you have been running from, because the running has exhausted itself, and midnight doesn't permit the usual evasions and there is nowhere left to go. She sat with it, and then, eventually, she did cry. Quietly, without drama, without the heaving theatrical release she'd imagined such a moment might produce. Just tears, steady and unremarkable, the way the rain outside was steady and unremarkable, doing what it did because it was the thing it did, without performance. She was still sitting there when the morning came. She hadn't slept. She'd sat in the kitchen chair with the photograph on the table in front of her and watched the quality of the light change, the window going from the deep charcoal of late night to the thin grey of earliest morning, the rain outside finally slowing and then stopping sometime around 4, the city gradually resuming its daytime sounds, the garbage trucks and delivery vans and early runners, the whole enormous apparatus of a city returning to operation after its brief nocturnal pause. She made coffee. She looked at the photograph while the coffee brewed. She looked at the woman in the photograph and tried to hold two things at once: the realness of that moment, the realness of that laugh, and the realness of everything that had come after it. Both things were true. That was the difficult thing. The thing she'd been avoiding understanding by keeping the box closed. Both things were entirely true. She drank her coffee, standing at the window, looking out at the wet street below, the puddles reflecting the morning sky and the wet black trees and the occasional person walking past with that particular post-rain city. Purposefulness. Everyone stepping over the evidence of the storm as if they hadn't all been inside waiting it out together. She thought about the subway station. She thought about the turnstile and the beeping and the pale, thin thing in the space between the machines, and about the sentence she hadn't said. She thought about what it would have meant to say it. Just let me through. The gift the sentence would have given her, easy passage, the gate choosing for her, the relief of surrender, and what the gate would have taken in exchange. Not money. Not fair. Something else. The part of her that had been, however haltingly, however imperfectly, doing the work of arriving at her own decisions. The part of her that had walked up the stairs and gone home and sat down. The part of her that had opened the box. She was still thinking about this when her phone buzzed on the counter. She looked at it. A text from a number she didn't recognise. The area code was New Mexico. It said, "I sent you something. I hope it found you. I'd like to talk if you're ever ready. No pressure, no timeline. Just when you're ready. Mum." Mara looked at the text for a long time. Then she looked at her phone and she typed, "I opened it. I'll call you. Not today, but soon." She put the phone down. She looked out the window at the wet street. Soon, she thought. And this time it was a different kind of soon. Not the soon of postponement, not the soon that was a synonym for never. A real soon. A soon with actual structure behind it, with a real day. She was already mentally placing it on, the way you place a book you intend to read on the nightstand instead of on the shelf. Soon. Concrete and genuinely meant. She finished her coffee and she went to bed. She slept for 7 hours without dreaming, which was unusual for her, and when she woke the sun was high and the street below was dry and the city was doing what it always did, which was everything at once, loudly. She lay in bed for a moment, taking inventory. She felt different, not fixed. She had enough self-knowledge to recognise that fixed was not a state that happened overnight or as a result of a single correct choice, but altered. Like a room after furniture has been rearranged, same room, same dimensions, but the way the light fell on things had changed, and you moved through it differently, and some views that had been blocked were now open. She was thinking about the turnstile, not with fear, with something more like curiosity, the cold intellectual curiosity of a person who has encountered something anomalous and is beginning, at a safe distance, to turn it over. She knew what she'd seen. She knew the sequence of events, the beeping, the screen, the sensor lights, the shape in the gap. She knew she hadn't imagined it. She'd spent enough years with her own anxiety to know the difference between the mind generating its own content and the mind responding to actual stimuli, and what she'd experienced in that station had had the textures of the real. Cold air, specific words, the concrete particular detail of sensor lights shifting when she shifted. She lay in bed and thought, who else? Because that was the thing. A phenomenon like that. A place like that. A thing like that at a specific threshold in a specific city. It wouldn't be selective. It wouldn't wait for her specifically. She'd been there because of her own particular archaeology of avoidance, her specific accumulation of tomorrows, but she wasn't the only person walking the city, at midnight in the rain. She wasn't the only one who arrived at that entrance without a real destination. She wasn't the only one with threshold promises rattling around the ribcage, and a sentence she was trying not to say. Who else had stood in front of that turnstile with the beeping matching their heartbeat? Who else had seen their name on the fare screen? And who, among those people, had said the sentence? This thought arrived with a quality of dread that was different from the dread she'd felt in the station. That dread had been personal and immediate, the body's response to present threat. This was slower, more abstract, a cold spreading certainty. She had gotten out. She had known, instinctively or by luck, not to say it. But someone hadn't. Someone had stood there with the beeping synchronized to their blood, and the screen showing their specific damage, and the pale, thin thing standing perfectly still in the gap, and had thought, yes, let the gate choose, let me just get through, had said the sentence, had passed through, and had found, on the other side, the tile pattern repeating, the same poster appearing twice, the same damp draft on the same wall, the same threshold, again and again, the concept of destination dissolving, the self dissolving with it, grain by grain, each repetition taking something until there was nothing left but the act of entering, again and again, always beginning, never arriving, the loop running without passenger. She got up, she showered, she ate. She did the ordinary morning things with a focus and a care she didn't usually give them, handling the small rituals of daily life with the attention of someone who has been briefly reminded that these things are not guaranteed, that the ordinary is earned, or at least that it can be lost, that the ability to stand in a kitchen making toast is contingent on 100 choices you might not notice you're making. She called her friend Dessa. Dessa was the closest thing she had to a best friend in this city, a biologist who worked at a university 3 subway stops north, and who had the specific quality of paying attention that made her valuable as both a scientist and a human being. She listened the way she observed specimens, with precision and without judgment, without rushing to conclusion. Mara had been avoiding calling Dessa for approximately the same amount of time she'd been avoiding opening the box, for reasons that were related. Dessa would ask how she was doing, and Mara would have to answer honestly, and the answer would require dealing with things she'd been packaging into the future. Dessa picked up on the second ring. "You're calling before noon," Dessa said. "Are you dying?" "No, I had a weird night." "Define weird." "I'll tell you in person. Can you do dinner?" "I can do dinner. That Thai place?" "Yes." 7. She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she put it in her pocket and looked at the photograph on the kitchen table. Her mother laughing, herself laughing. Both of them wet and not caring, at a beach on a day she couldn't remember, but that had clearly, undeniably happened. She picked up the photograph and carried it to the bookshelf in the living room, and found a space for it between 2 books, propping it against the spine of a novel she'd never finished. She stepped back and looked at it. It looked like it belonged there. She spent the rest of the morning working, actually working, sitting at her desk with her laptop and the specific focused attention, that she'd been struggling to access for months. The thing that happened when you cleared enough internal space for something other than avoidance to occupy it. She was a researcher, technically, though she'd let her university affiliation lapse along with the dissertation defence, and the work she did now was more like consulting, writing reports for organisations about community-level interventions, translating academic language into plain sentences, doing the connective tissue work between research and practice that nobody had a clean title for. She was good at it. She didn't always feel like it, but she was good at it, and today she worked with the particular ease of someone operating inside their own competence, sentences arriving with a smoothness that had been absent for weeks. She broke for lunch. She ate at the kitchen table without looking at the empty space where the box had been, without compensating for the box's absence the way you compensate for furniture that's been moved, without the small, careful avoidance that had shaped her relationship with this room for 3 weeks. She sat at the table and ate a sandwich and looked at nothing in particular and felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily calculate, approximately fine. This is the part she'd tell Dessa about at dinner. Not the station, not yet. The station was harder. The station required context and a glass of wine, and the specific kind of attention Dessa gave things when she understood they mattered. But the box, the photograph, the text she'd sent back, the morning that had followed, she'd tell Dessa all of that, and Dessa would listen, and then she'd say something precise and accurate and slightly annoying in its accuracy, and Mara would argue with it for 30 seconds and then acknowledge she was right, and that would be that. She was thinking about this, about the comfortable predictability of her friendship with Dessa, when she became aware of the sound. She stopped eating. She sat very still. It was faint. It was coming from, not from inside the apartment, from outside, from below. From the street, possibly, or from the building's mechanical infrastructure, its plumbing and ventilation, the hidden systems running behind walls. A regular sound. A soft electronic tone, evenly spaced. Her heart rate went up. The sound paced itself to her heart rate. Mara pushed back from the table. She stood up and crossed to the window and looked down at the street 4 floors below. Midday, sunny, dry from the morning's rain. A delivery person on a bicycle. An elderly man with a small dog. 2 women with strollers. A city doing its ordinary daytime things with absolutely no regard for her or her history of avoidance or what had happened at the Delancey Street station the night before. The sound stopped. She stood at the window for a long moment, her hands against the glass, the slight vibration of the city's constant activity coming through the pane. Then she lowered her hands. She went back to her lunch. She ate it. She cleaned up. She went back to her desk and worked for another 4 hours. She did not hear the sound again. At 6:30 she changed her jacket, still slightly damp from last night. Hanging over the bathroom door, she hung it properly and took a different one from the closet. And she locked her apartment and rode the elevator down and went out into the street. The evening was clear, the storm having cleaned the air with a thoroughness that made the light look sharper than usual. The colours of the buildings and the leaves and the storefronts more saturated. The sky above the city a deep and honest blue. She walked south toward the restaurant. She was walking south. The Thai place was south. Dessa's university was north. The restaurant was equidistant. They always met there because of this. She was walking south. The Delancey Street station was south. She was aware of this. She was aware that she was going to walk past it, that the route to the restaurant took her within a block of the entrance, and she was deciding as she walked how she was going to handle that. She would not go in. That was firm, decided, not negotiable. She would not go in because there was no reason to go in, and also because she was meeting Dessa, and the train would take longer than walking. She would walk past. If she heard beeping, she would ignore it. If she felt the entrance exhale its mineral breath at her, she would ignore that too. She would walk past it the way she walked past 100 things every day. The gym she'd been meaning to join, the bookstore with the book in the window she'd been meaning to buy, the coffee shop where she'd had one good conversation with a stranger 2 years ago and kept hoping to repeat it. And she would continue past, and the restaurant would be 4 more blocks, and Dessa would be there, with her water glass already empty because she always drank water too fast while waiting. She turned the corner onto Delancey. The entrance was halfway down the block. She could see the iron railing, the descent of the stairs, the fluorescent glow emanating from below in the early evening light. A few people were entering. A young man with headphones. A woman with a canvas bag from the farmer's market stuffed with vegetables. A teenager walking and staring at a phone. Ordinary transit traffic, the city metabolizing itself. Mara walked past it. She kept her eyes forward and she walked past it, and the entrance did nothing. It made no specific sound at her, emitted no unusual light, reached toward her with no particular cold or pull. It was a subway entrance. She walked past it and continued down the block and turned the corner, and the restaurant was 3 blocks further, and she could already see the awning. She exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. Dessa was already there, at their usual table near the window, her water glass indeed already half empty, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead the way she wore them when she was looking at her phone. She looked up when Mara came in and did the specific eyebrow thing that meant she was already analysing something. "You look like you slept," Dessa said. This was a compliment from Dessa, who was precise with observations. 7 hours, Mara sat down. "I haven't slept 7 consecutive hours in months. Something happened? Several things? Okay." Dessa put her phone down. This was significant. Dessa putting her phone completely face down on a table meant she was giving you full attention, which she did selectively and on purpose, and which felt like being handed something valuable. "Tell me." So Mara told her about the box, about the photograph, about her mother's note, the specific phrasing of it. "I'm sorry it took me so long to know what sorry means," and what that phrase had done to her when she'd read it. About sitting in the kitchen until morning and crying quietly and then making coffee. About the text she'd sent back, the real soon, the soon with actual structure. Dessa listened. She asked one question, midway through. "What's in the photograph specifically?" and absorbed the answer and went back to listening. When Mara was done, Dessa was quiet for a moment, her glass raised halfway to her mouth and held there while she finished processing. "That's significant," she said. "Finally." "I know." The phrasing of the note is significant. She's not apologising for what she did. She's apologising for not understanding what an apology required. That's exactly it. Which is, it's not nothing. It's not everything, but it's not nothing. No. Mara looked at the menu she didn't need to look at because she always ordered the same thing. It's not nothing. What are you going to do about it? Call her. Not yet, but soon. Dessa put her glass down. The real kind of soon. Yeah. Okay. Dessa picked up her own menu. Good. What else happened? You said several things. Mara was quiet for a moment. The restaurant was filling up around them, the early dinner crowd arriving with the specific energy of people who'd made reservations and were pleased with themselves for it. Plates were going past. The smell of lemongrass and chili and something sweet and caramelized moved through the air and made Mara aware of how hungry she was. "There's something else," she said, "but it's harder to explain. Try." So she told Dessa about the subway station. Not everything at once. She started at the beginning, the rain, the walk, arriving at the top of the stairs with no actual destination, and she moved through it carefully, trying to describe what she'd experienced with the precision of something you want someone to understand rather than dismiss. The beeping and its synchrony with her pulse, the words on the fare screen, the sensor lights, the thing in the gap between the machines, the reflection that had already crossed. Dessa listened to all of it without interrupting. This was unusual. Dessa habitually asked clarifying questions while people talked, the scientist instinct to verify data points in real time. That she didn't ask any while Mara described the station meant she was listening in a different mode, the mode she used when she was reserving judgment, when she was collecting the whole picture before beginning to analyse. When Mara finished, Dessa was quiet for long enough that the waiter came and they ordered and he left. Then Dessa said, "You didn't say it." "No." "The sentence." "No." "What stopped you?" Mara thought about how to answer this. I realised that was what it wanted. I could feel the shape of the sentence in my throat. I knew exactly what it would feel like to say it, and I knew that what felt like relief was actually surrender, giving the gate something it would keep. And you offered the silence instead. I didn't plan to. My hand just did it, held the card over the reader without tapping. Dessa nodded slowly, and then it stopped, and then it stopped. Their food arrived. They ate in the comfortable way of old friends who don't need to fill silence with noise, who can eat and think and return to the conversation without loss of thread. After a while, Dessa said, "I want to tell you something, and I don't want you to take it wrong." "Okay, I believe you." Mara looked up. "I know you do." I mean, I believe you specifically, Dessa said. Not in the skeptic's courtesy sense, not like I'm indulging you. I mean that what you're describing has internal consistency. It has the specific texture of real experience, and the fact that you're telling it to me with that particular flatness you use when you're trying to accurately describe something, sounds crazy. That's actually evidence of reliability. You're not performing this. I'm not. And the other thing I want to say is, Dessa paused, moving food around on her plate, assembling the thought. The thing it's feeding on isn't unique to you. The hesitation at thresholds, the promises you make at doorways and don't keep. That's an extremely common human experience, which means if it exists, if this thing at the station exists and it does what you're describing, it's not just me. It's everyone who arrives at that entrance at the wrong time in the wrong state of mind. That's what I've been thinking about since this morning, Dessa looked at her. Since this morning. I woke up thinking about who else. And I don't know who else. I don't know how to find out. I don't know how long it's been happening or how many people have stood there and said the sentence and what happens to them after. If they get out. If they get back. Dessa put down her fork. This was the second significant gesture of the evening. Dessa putting down her fork, which she did only when food had completely stopped mattering relative to the thing she was thinking about. You said the loop, she said. What you described, each entry becoming the same threshold, the subway not carrying them anywhere, it's not just a metaphor. No. Something happens to them, physically. They go through that gate and they don't come out the other side. Or they come out a version of the other side that keeps sending them back to the entrance. Dessa was quiet again. The specific, intense quiet of a person whose mind is moving fast. Then she said, very carefully, "How many missing persons cases do you think there are in this city?" Mara looked at her. "Annually," Dessa said. "Transit adjacent. People who go into the subway system and don't come back out. People who are seen entering a station and not seen exiting. The MTA has data. There are reports. I know someone who works in transit safety. We did a study together 2 years ago, population health intersecting with public transit. She mentioned something once, something I half-filed and forgot about. Anomalous exit data. Entries without corresponding exits at a handful of stations. Which stations? I don't remember. I'd have to ask her. Mara became aware that her hands were very still on the table. She was holding them still deliberately, keeping them from whatever gesture they wanted to make. Dessa. I know. I'm not saying I know. Because I got out, I did the thing, and I got out, and I went home and opened the box, and I'm here, and I'm... Mara, she stopped. I know, Dessa said, but you're the one who woke up thinking about who else. The waiter came by with the check, which neither of them had asked for, and they sat with it between them for a moment. Call your friend from Transit Safety, Mara said. I'll call her tomorrow, and tell me what she says. I'll tell you what she says. Dessa picked up the check. And in the meantime, I know, don't go back. Don't go back. Dessa looked at her steadily with the specific look she used when she meant something completely and wanted to make sure that meaning was received. Promise me. Mara thought about the word promise. Thought about threshold promises and what it meant to make them, and what it meant to make one here, across a dinner table in a restaurant smelling of lemongrass, to a friend who was watching her with the precision of a scientist who cares about her data. Thought about the difference between a promise made to avoid the discomfort of the moment and a promise made because it was the true thing, the thing you actually intended. She intended this. I promise, she said. They split the check and walked out into the evening, which had gone properly dark now. The blue entirely faded from the sky, and the city's own light taking over. They walked together for 2 blocks, until Dessa's direction and Mara's direction separated, and they said goodbye with a hug of people who've talked about something real and know they'll be talking about it more. Mara walked home. She walked a different route, one that went east of Delancey rather than along it, adding 3 blocks but keeping her clear of the entrance. She didn't feel foolish doing this. She felt like a person who had made a promise and was keeping it, which was, she noted as she walked, a completely different feeling from the performance of avoidance she'd been practicing. Not a tomorrow or an almost or a not. Yet, an actual kept thing. She went upstairs. She sat in the living room with the photograph on the bookshelf and she looked at it for a while. Then she went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about Dessa's friend in transit safety and the anomalous exit data and the handful of stations where entries didn't have corresponding exits. She thought about all the people who had stood at the top of those stairs in the rain, looking down. She thought about the ones who had said the sentence. She thought about what it meant to be at the point of entry forever, always beginning, never arriving. The loop running until whatever constituted a self had been completely consumed, until there was nothing left but the motion of entering, the mechanical act of a body passing through a gate, the beeping matching a heartbeat that was still technically beating, but that had given over its decision-making to the gate that had been waiting for exactly this and had got it and was satisfied. She fell asleep thinking about this, and she did not dream of the station. She dreamed instead, strangely, of the beach in the photograph, of being 7 or 8 and wet and laughing, her mother beside her, both of them looking at something outside the frame, something that had made them both incandescent with it. She woke once in the night, heart briefly elevated, and lay still and listened to the sounds of the building, the elevator, the distant traffic, a pipe somewhere doing whatever pipes do at 3 a.m, and everything was ordinary, and she let her heart slow and she went back to sleep. Dessa called the following afternoon. I talked to Priya, she said. Priya was the transit safety person. I want you to hear this. Mara sat down. Tell me. So the anomalous exit data is real. It's flagged as a data quality issue in their internal records, supposedly. Incomplete sensor coverage, malfunctioning exit readers, the explanation for why some events don't have corresponding exit events is always technological in the paperwork. But Priya says, and she said this carefully, she was choosing her words carefully, which I noticed. She says the data quality explanation doesn't actually hold for all of the cases, that there are entries with no exits where the equipment was functioning correctly, where the entry was captured clean and the person simply never exited, or not on that system. How many? She wasn't specific, she said a non-trivial number. She said it in the way people say things when they've been told not to say the actual number. And Delancey, a pause, she didn't name stations, I asked. She said she wasn't able to discuss specifics. But she didn't say Delancey wasn't one of them. She didn't say any station wasn't one of them. She was very specifically not saying anything in a way that was itself a kind of saying something. Dessa paused. There's something else. What? I asked if there were any patterns in the demographics of the unreturned entries. Age, time of day, anything. And she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, again very carefully, that the entries that lacked exits tended to cluster around certain hours, primarily between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m, and that the individuals involved, where identity could be established from card data, tended to have, she used the phrase, disrupted transit patterns, meaning they weren't regular commuters. They weren't people who took the same train to work every day. They were people whose card usage was irregular, who tended to enter without clear destination logic, who used transit the way you use transit when you don't actually have somewhere to be. Mara was very still. People who arrive at the station without a real destination. That's the pattern. People who are using the subway for the motion of it. The illusion of going somewhere. Mara, that's who it finds. That's specifically who it finds. That's what the data suggests. Mara stood up and walked to the window. The street below was ordinary and bright. Midday traffic, a woman walking a large dog, nothing sinister in any direction, and yet the image of the turnstile was overlaid on all of it now. The beeping, the pale shape in the gap, the words on the screen. How many people? She said. I told you she wasn't. Dessa, how many? Another long pause. She mentioned a time frame. The last 4 years. I asked about 4 years because that's when the MTA upgraded their entry and exit reader systems citywide, so the data quality before that is actually worse and harder to evaluate. So 4 years. She said in 4 years, across the full system there are... Dessa stopped. Say it. There are approximately 230 entries with no corresponding exit, where equipment function can be ruled out as the explanation. The number sat there in the phone call between them. 230 people who had gone in and not come out. 230 instances of the gate accepting the sentence. She doesn't think it's the same place, Dessa said. She said the distribution is across the system, which means, if this is what you're describing, if turnstile vow or whatever is the right word for it, it's not just one gate. It's not one gate. It's the threshold. It's the mechanism. It's the specific type of place and the specific type of person and the specific type of moment, and those things exist everywhere in the system. It's everywhere, Mara said. It's wherever the right conditions are. She stood at the window for a while after the call. stood there with the phone in her hand and the street below doing its ordinary things and the number sitting in her chest where she'd put it. 230. The weight of it. The specific weight of that many people encountering the gate in the worst possible moment and asking it to choose for them. She thought about what she wanted to do with this. She thought about the options. She could do nothing. She'd gotten out, she had made a promise. She could put this on the shelf alongside all the other things she'd put on shelves and get on with her life, which was rearranging itself towards something better and which deserved her attention. That was the sane option. The self-protective option. The option her therapist, the one she'd ghosted, the one she was now, as of this morning, composing a careful email to reschedule, would probably recommend. She could also go back, not to tap the card, not to ask to be let through, to understand what she'd encountered, in the same way that you return to the sight of something, not to relive it, but to see it in daylight, to give it the confrontation that being witnessed provides. She knew the mechanism now. She'd demonstrated once that she could stand in front of the gate and offer the silence and not say the sentence. The question was whether that would be enough to go back and look clearly, or whether there was something specific to nighttime and rain and the particular accumulation of her worst week that had created the conditions, and whether those conditions would reproduce in ordinary daytime. She thought, 230. She thought, I am a researcher. I translate things. That is the work I actually do. She called Dessa back. I want to go back, she said, before Dessa could speak. In daylight, with you. I want to look at it. A long pause. Mara, I know what I said. I know. But I'm not going because I need the gate to decide something. I'm going because I want to see it, and because there are 230 people who didn't get out, and someone should be going toward that rather than away from it, and I'm... She stopped. I'm the person who knows what the mechanism is. I'm the person who's been in front of it and come back. You don't know if it's daytime specific. No. You don't know if the conditions that activated it were specific to that night. No. You don't know if going back with purpose, without the thing it needs, the genuine uncertain hesitation, changes anything. No. You don't know anything, Mara, and neither do I. I know. I'm still asking you to come with me. Dessa was quiet for 10 full seconds. Mara counted them. Then, if either of us says anything to the gate, we won't. If either of us feels the beeping, we leave immediately, and we go in the daytime, before 4 in the afternoon. Yes, another pause. Tomorrow, Dessa said finally. 1 p.m. I'll meet you at the corner of Delancey and Essex. Thank you. Don't thank me. I'm doing this because you're my friend, and I'm deeply invested in your well-being, and also because I am, against my better judgment, genuinely scientifically curious, and those two things together are probably going to get me into trouble one day. Probably, Mara agreed. 1 p.m. tomorrow, corner of Delancey and Essex. And Mara, I know, say it. Don't say it. Whatever happens, don't say it. Whatever happens, Dessa said. Don't say it. The next morning Mara woke early, before 7, with the particular alertness of someone who has been sleeping next to a decision. She made coffee. She looked at the photograph. She did an hour of work, ordinary and focused, because she'd learned in the last 2 days that keeping the thread of normal life running was not a distraction from the other thing, but a support for it, that the ordinary and the extraordinary needed each other for ballast, that you couldn't look at the extraordinary directly without something ordinary to brace yourself against. At 12:30 she put on her jacket, the dry one, not the one from the rain, and she went downstairs and she walked south. The day was fine, cool, mid-50s, the kind of clarity that follows a major storm by 24 hours, the air entirely processed and the light finding everything with a directness that made the city look slightly more honest than usual. She walked south, and she felt the ordinary progress of her feet on the sidewalk, and the ordinary weight of the city around her, the buses and the scaffolding and the restaurants setting up their outdoor tables, even though it was probably too cold for outdoor dining, but nobody in this city ever gave up on outdoor dining before they absolutely had to. Dessa was already at the corner when she arrived, in her work coat and reading glasses still on her forehead. 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She held one out. Peace offering. To who? To whatever we're doing. Dessa looked down the block toward the entrance. Okay, tell me again what to expect. Mara told her again, quickly, the relevant details. The beeping, the screen. Not to look at the space between the second and third machine, if there was anything in her peripheral vision there. Not to say anything out loud in the station. Nothing out loud, Dessa confirmed. Fine, okay. She drank. Her coffee. Let's go. They walked down the block together, Mara was aware of her body, the state of it, checking it the way you check a car before a long drive. Heart rate, shoulder tension, the quality of her breath. Normal, all normal. No pull toward hesitation, no accumulation of threshold weight, no specific unanswered question pressing from inside her ribs. She had a destination. She was meeting a friend. She had plans for the afternoon after this. She was a person arriving at a subway entrance because she had chosen to arrive there, which was an entirely different thing from arriving because she had no other place to go. They stood at the top of the stairs. Below, the fluorescent lights were just fluorescent lights. The air coming up from underground was just the underground smell, metal and electricity and rubber, and the faint trace of 10,000 people who passed through today already. Normal, baseline normal. They went down. The stairs were dry. Midday foot traffic had been through. Scuff marks on each step. The railing worn where hands had gripped. At the bottom the drain was empty. No standing water. Just the clean damp concrete of a surface that had been wet and dried. The turnstiles stood in their row. Mara looked at the machines. 4 of them. 2 standard, 1 wide gate, 1 emergency exit. The fare screens glowed their blue-white. The sensor lights were flat and green. Everything correct. Everything mechanical. Everything entirely unremarkable. She looked at the space between the second and third machine. Empty. Just the space between 2 pieces of metal, approximately 18 inches, the fluorescent light landing on the floor there without incident or significance. Dessa was beside her, very still, doing her observing thing, taking everything in without comment, and Mara was aware of how much she appreciated that. The quality of Dessa's presence, the way it allowed you to look at things without immediately having to translate them into language. They stood there for a while. A man came down the stairs behind them and moved past them to the turnstiles and tapped his card with the efficiency of someone who does this without thought, and went through, and the gate beeped once, ordinarily, the standard acknowledgement of a valid fare, and he was through and gone down the corridor and the turnstile rotated back to rest. The beeping had been ordinary, one tone, functional, the machine doing its machine thing. Mara stepped closer to the middle turnstile. She looked at the fare screen. It was displaying the fare amount and the tap icon and the small circular animation, and her name was nowhere on it, and the screen was doing nothing extraordinary, and she stood in front of it in the midday ordinary light and felt nothing. The specific nothing of a place doing its neutral thing, indifferent, mechanical, uncalibrated to her. It knows, she thought. Or rather, it doesn't need to. The conditions aren't here. She was here with intention and company and a destination and a full chest and none of the specific configuration of emptiness and avoidance and accumulated tomorrows that she'd brought to this entrance 2 nights ago. She wasn't carrying the right offering. She hadn't arrived with the quality it required. She looked at the sensor lights. Flat green. Not moving. She looked at the floor. Just the floor, the terracotta concrete with its compressed grout lines, her own reflection broken and incomplete and doing exactly what she was doing. She turned to Dessa. Dessa was watching the space between the machines. Her expression was unreadable in the way it got when she was processing something, and she was standing very still, and her coffee cup was in both hands as if she'd forgotten it was there. Mara touched her arm. Dessa looked at her. "Let's go up," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "I've seen enough." They went up the stairs and back into the daylight and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, both of them adjusting to the light and the open air and the uncomplicated sound of the city. "You didn't see anything," Mara said. "I didn't see anything." Dessa looked at her coffee, seemed to remember it, drank from it. But. There was a temperature differential between that specific space, she nodded toward the entrance, and the rest of the station. I don't know how to quantify it without instruments, but there was a pocket of cold air in the space you described. Between the second and third machine, it was notably colder than its surroundings in a way that wasn't explicable by proximity to the exterior or ventilation patterns. Mara looked at her. I noticed it, and I moved slightly toward it, and there was a moment where I wanted to look directly at it. I had a very strong impulse to turn and look directly at the space between the machines. Dessa paused. I didn't. You didn't. No. A pause. The impulse was unusual in its quality. It wasn't just curiosity. It was It felt like the look would be the beginning of something. Like once I looked, the looking would be the first move in a sequence I wouldn't control. They stood on the sidewalk. "Okay," Mara said. "Okay," Dessa said. They were both quiet for a moment, holding their paper cups in the midday light. "So it's there during the day," Mara said. "It's just dormant, or selective, or we weren't the right configuration for it," Dessa said. "Which confirms what you experienced. The conditions have to be right. The person has to arrive with a specific quality, the genuine aimlessness, the threshold weight, what did you call it? The accumulated tomorrows. Yes. Which means it can't be reached by people who know what it is and come looking for it. Or not easily, not from the outside approach." Dessa finished her coffee and held the empty cup. "It can only be encountered accidentally, by the kind of person who doesn't know to be looking for it, because they're too busy not looking at their own avoidance. That's the design of it," Mara said. If design is the right word, it's the function of it." They walked away from the entrance south, in the direction neither of them had said they were going, but which felt like the right direction, away from the station into the afternoon. "The 230, Mara said after a while. "I know. They're in there. We don't know what in there means." "No, but they went through the gate and they're not. They didn't come out the way they went in, or not into anything mappable. They're in the loop." She thought about this, about what the loop would be like, the experience of it, arriving at the turnstile again and again, the same damp draft, the same poster, the same beeping matching your heartbeat, the concept of destination dissolving. At first you'd try. You'd go through and find yourself at the entrance again, and you'd panic and you'd try again, and you'd find yourself at the entrance again, and eventually... What? Eventually the panic would exhaust itself. Eventually the trying would stop. Eventually all that was left was the entering, the rote mechanical act, and after long enough of that there'd be nothing left of the person who'd entered to notice that the person had been lost. "How do we get them back?" she said. Dessa stopped walking. "Mara!" "I know. No, I don't think you do." Dessa turned to look at her, and her expression now had something in it that Mara recognised as the expression Dessa wore when she was about to say something that cost her something. "I believe you. I'm going to say that again because I mean it. I believe you, and I believe what I felt in that station, and I believe the data Priya described. I believe that there is something at that threshold that is real, and that it takes people and doesn't give them back. I believe all of that. But you are one person. You are one person who encountered this thing on the worst night of an already difficult week, and who, by combination of instinct and luck and whatever else, found the correct response and got out. That is extraordinary. It is also not a skill set. It is not a method. It is not a repeatable intervention. I know it isn't. Trying to go back in and retrieve 230 people who are trapped in a loop you don't fully understand, using a mechanism you've tested exactly once. I'm not saying I go back in." Mara started walking again, and Dessa fell into step beside her. "I'm not saying that. I don't know what I'm saying. I'm saying I can't just know this and walk away from it." "What can you do instead of walk away from it?" "Tell someone." "Who?" "I don't know. Someone. Anyone. Someone who has the resources and the authority to... I don't know. Map it. Document it. Find a way to help the people who are likely to encounter it before they encounter it." She thought about this as she walked, the thinking, happening in her feet as much as her head, the same way it had 2 nights ago, the walking thinking. If the pattern is people who arrive without destination, who use transit to avoid rather than to go, if those are the people it finds, then maybe the intervention isn't at the gate. Maybe it's upstream. Maybe it's the person standing at the top of the stairs at midnight in the rain before they go down. Dessa was quiet, processing. What if someone had been at the top of those stairs 2 nights ago, Mara said. What if there'd been a person there? Just a person. Someone who asked me where I was going. Not a gate. A person. Would I have gone down? Would you? No. I don't think I would have. Because the whole function of what I was doing, the whole point of the midnight walk, was the absence of being seen. The avoidance of witness. If someone had seen me standing at the top of those stairs with no destination, and had said, "Hey, where are you going?" I would have answered, and in answering I would have had to confront the fact that I wasn't going anywhere, and that confrontation might have been enough. She paused. Or it might have sent me down faster. I don't know. You can't install humans at every subway entrance at midnight. No, But she thought about the transit safety data, about Priya and her carefully chosen words, about the non-trivial number and the disrupted transit patterns and the entries without exits. Maybe the data itself is the intervention. Maybe if Priya's data was taken seriously instead of filed as equipment malfunction, someone would be looking for a pattern. Someone would be looking for the common thread. And the common thread leads to a profile, and the profile leads to a targeted approach, and the approach gets people off the stairs before they go down, gets people off the stairs. They walked for a while in silence, the good kind of silence, the kind that's full rather than empty. I can talk to Priya. Again, Dessa said, more directly. Tell her I have a specific interest in the data, that I want to look at it properly. Without telling her everything. But Priya is a careful person who has been looking at data that doesn't make sense and making herself not look at it too hard. And I think if I give her a reason to look at it hard, she will. Okay. And in the meantime, Dessa stopped walking and looked at Mara. Call your mother? Mara blinked. That's a pivot. It's not. It's the same thing. Dessa's expression was very direct, the full precision of it trained on her. The box was the threshold you'd been avoiding. You opened it. There's another one waiting. You know what it is. And you're better at thresholds than you think you are. You proved that 2 nights ago. Use that. Don't wait for the right moment. There isn't one. Mara stood on the sidewalk in the midday light. Then she took out her phone. She found the New Mexico number in her messages. She pressed call. It rang twice. Her mother picked up. Mara. Her voice was the same. Exactly the same as Mara remembered it. And also different. Lower than she remembered. With a quality of effort in it that hadn't been there before. The quality of someone who has been carrying something and is setting it down carefully. I didn't think you'd call so soon. I said soon, Mara said. I meant it. A pause. On the other end of the line, 4 states away in a house she'd never seen. Her mother exhaled. It was the full-body kind. The kind from the photograph almost. I'm glad, her mother said. I'm really glad. Dessa was watching her from 3 feet away with an expression she'd never quite seen on Dessa before. Something warm and deliberately restrained. The expression of a person who is giving you your moment and standing close enough to catch you if you need it. I got the photograph, Mara said. I don't remember that day. It was Rockaway Beach. You were 7, you thought. The waves were trying to eat you. A small involuntary sound came out of Mara that was almost a laugh. Were they? They were trying to eat everything. That's what waves do. Her mother paused. We were there all day. You got sunburned, but you didn't care. You kept going back in. I kept going back in, Mara said. Not a question, just hearing it. Holding the picture of the 7-year-old girl who kept going back in. You always went back in, her mother said quietly. Even when things scared you. That was always true of you. Mara stood on a sidewalk in New York City in the clear post-storm light, with her phone pressed to her ear and her free hand hanging at her side, and Dessa nearby, and the whole enormous city doing what it did around her, and she stayed in the call. She didn't exit early. She didn't give a vague excuse. She didn't think about what she'd eat for dinner. She went back in. They talked for 40 minutes. It was hard in places and easier in others, and some of it was left for other conversations, and some of it was said that had needed to be said for 4 years. And none of it resolved everything, but all of it was real. Actually real. Real in the way that the alternative, the box sitting on the table for another 3 weeks, another year, another 4 years, was not. When they said goodbye, it was with the specific tentativeness of 2 people who have found a rope bridge and are testing the boards, who don't yet know how much weight it will hold, but who have agreed that the testing is necessary and that they will do it carefully. After she hung up, Dessa said, How was it? Hard. Good. Both. You stayed on for 40 minutes. Yes. That's... Dessa smiled, which she did rarely and completely when she did, the full thing. That's something. I know. They stood in the afternoon for a moment. Then Dessa said, Dinner next week. Dinner next week. And I'll call Priya. And you'll call Priya. They went their separate ways in the midday. City and Mara walked home through streets that smelled of nothing in particular. Ordinary asphalt and exhaust and someone's cooking from an open window. And she thought about the 7-year-old who kept going back in. And she thought about the turnstile. And she thought about the 230 and she thought, not today. Today she'd gone to the station and come back and called her mother and had 40 minutes of a conversation that needed to happen, and that was what today had been for. and tomorrow and next week and the weeks after would be for other things. She thought about the pale shape in the gap between the machines, the patience of it, the absolute unhurried patience of something that had been waiting since before she was born and would wait long after, and was never surprised by what arrived at its threshold, because it understood that the city would always generate people who needed to arrive there, people with their pockets full of